February to quell the revolt in Ireland. There followed 2 very bloody years of war between 1919 and 1921. In India, the dynamic is not that dissimilar. But the main example of colonial violence came, of course, at the massacre at Amritsar. Amritsar was the site of a famous Punjabi festival, and there had been the declaration of martial law in India to quell the growing nationalist meetings that had gathered steam in 1919. And the local military commander, General Reginald Dyer, insisted on using the full force of martial law by declaring the gathering at this festival to be illegal and declaring it to be organised by the Indian National Congress. Over 1,000 people were killed, many women and children, shot by machine guns in a walled space where all the exits were blocked. The official figure was 300 dead. But over 1,500 rounds of ammunition were fired at the crowd for 10 minutes. It was unusually such a scale of violence that it was condemned across the political spectrum. Winston Churchill was one of those who thought it was a barbaric episode. The Labour Party were obviously fierce in their denunciations. But Dyer found much support in Britain, not least through a newspaper known as the Morning Post that collected £26,000 to its subscription fund to provide Dyer in his retirement because he was court-martialed and stripped of his duties. It was this, if you follow the news, it was Amritsar that the current Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, went and visited a couple of weeks ago and did or did not, no one's quite sure of whether he apologised or not. The last place I want to talk about is Iraq. You'll remember that the Air Force had begun to play a very small role in the Great War. And much of the place where the Air Force was most successful was on large territories, obviously away from the big infantry guns. In the 1920s, Britain decided that air control was going to be a very effective way of policing its new imperial territories in the Middle East and in East Africa. Air control seemed to be ideally suited for a low-cost empire, where you could use air control to cover a lot of ground very quickly without having to have people or military posts on the spot. And in Iraq, in 1920 to 1921, Winston Churchill, who's coming up a lot today, who was then Colonial Secretary, developed the idea of air control with, interestingly, one of the great heroes of the Mesopotamia campaign of the First World War, T.E. Lawrence. They wanted to use the aerial bombardment on civilians and nomadic groups to have a moral effect on the population. The idea was not just the speed of transmission and the cost-effectiveness of air control, but the idea that aerial bombardment would have a moral effect, a pacifying effect on the population. It would demonstrate the omnipotent power of British colonial rule. And surprise, surprise, it was in Iraq that someone who will become infamous in the Second World War, Arthur Bomber Harris, developed the idea of saturation aerial bombardment, a lesson that, of course, would be taken to the continent of Europe during the Second World War. So that's the story of repression. And that repression was counterbalanced by attempts at reform that were always compromises and that in many ways energized as much as satiated the demands of nationalists. So the first set of reforms came in India with the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms that expanded the representative mechanisms to allow Indians to vote in local elections for provincial governments, or some Indians to vote for provincial governments. In Ireland, at the end of the war, of course, there was the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty that established the creation of the Irish Free State, but of course didn't allow the Republic at all. That Ireland continued, even though it was called a Free State, to be part of the British Empire, and that of course created a civil war for the next decade between those who defended the treaty and those who did not. And finally, in 1922, following basically 3 years of martial law in Egypt, there was formal recognition of Egyptian independence in 1922. In 1924, the idea was to hold a grand imperial conference at Wembley in London. Indeed, Wembley Stadium, where the finest of all rubbish national soccer teams, England, plays, was built as part of this imperial conference. The idea was that the imperial conference would show that the empire had weathered the storm and that there was a new unity amongst increasingly independent nations. And finally, in 1931, the Statute of Westminster is passed, in which the Dominions were finally released of the legal requirement to acknowledge legislation passed in the mother of all parliaments in Westminster. It's only in 1931 that Westminster legislation is no longer overrides that done in the parliaments of Dominions in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, any questions before I wrap up? So the Irish Republican movement basically fractured over between those who accepted the treaty as the best possible deal that Republicans could get, and a modicum of self-rule, well, not a modicum, an idea of self-rule, of home rule, and those who thought that the declaration of a republic, completely independent of Britain, was a compromise that they were not prepared to compromise on that. And so that's the conflict between those who accepted the treaty and those who didn't. Those who believed that independence would only come with the declaration of a republic, and those who were prepared to accept a sort of halfway house. And there was literally a military conflict between the new Irish government and the Republicans who continued to refuse to accept the legitimacy of the Free State. And that went on up through the 1930s. Anything else? Yeah. Wembley, the stadium at Wembley, which has been so stunningly redesigned in the last decade, was built in 1924 for this conference, and I'm not sure that you can see this, but here's a sort of, there it is, there's Wembley Stadium. Oh, 3 lines on my chest, I can hear my heart beating at the very thought of it. There I am running out into the pitch, and oh, I just scored the winning goal. No, sorry, I'm digressing. You can, this is basically the outline of the whole Wembley exhibition. But obviously the centrepiece is this fabulous stadium, and my childhood dreams of scoring a winning goal, or just actually displaying on it will be fine, or indeed just walking out on the pitch will be fine. But anyway, enough of my sad middle-aged fantasies. There's a lot more where that came from. It's a very dangerous, slippery slope for me to get started on that. So let me conclude, so you'll get out before you become my therapist. So the basic point that I've been trying to talk about today is the sort of cultural and political rehabilitation of Britain after the Great War. And the way in which many people, whether it was in terms of the domestic environment and the relationship between the sexes, whether it was about discovering the tranquility and the peace of the countryside, the idea that only the countryside, not industrial urban Britain, that seemed to produce the carnage of the First World War, but something else as the basis of a new order, and those that embraced the idea of political stability in the political turmoil of the 1920s. I've obviously been trying to suggest, not least through the example of the Empire, that this was very much a fragile exercise. Okay? Amidst all of this attempt to restore and create stability in Britain, there was an endless series of wars across the British Empire, there was the general strike, there was a good deal of industrial unease. But the bottom line is, basically, that you do have something that looks very different for significant sections of the population. I don't want to argue that in the 1920s and the 1930s you get a new type of bourgeois conservative modernity associated with suburban life. That is to say, it's the new bourgeoisie who buy their own houses in suburbia, who embrace the Conservative Party and focus on growing their roses, not on reading about the latest imperial adventure. Okay? Because this was a broader affair than simply the new suburban bourgeoisie. Many working people also believed in this need to restore stability and tranquility. It wasn't simply something that was the property of any one class. The Great War had been a psychically very tumultuous experience for many Britons, and many people felt the need to try and re-establish forms of cultural and social stability in its aftermath. It was just, as we will see on Thursday, incredibly difficult for many sections of the population to be able to do that. Okay. So I'll see you on Thursday, and you'll hear all about the wonders of the interwar economy.